Today's episode of the Occasional Podcast is sponsored by Atocha Design. Atocha Design of New York handcrafts heirloom quality furniture for storing records and audio components right here in the U.S. From cocktail tables to their series of record cabinets, Atocha Design makes high-end furniture that not only allows for quick access to your vinyl collection, but does so in a way that is both beautiful and functional. Each handcrafted piece was designed and constructed with careful consideration to specifically accommodate the heavy weight of an LP collection. Every item is made to order and can be customized with a range of wood and hardware options. Check out their entire catalog of bespoke products at Atocha Design. That's ATOCHADESIGN.com. They also ship internationally. The Occasional Podcast. Today's interview is with Andruw Jones.
Andruw Jones, center fielder for the Atlanta Braves. Not from like 96 to, 2002. I think he won a ring with the Yankees. That Andruw Jones?
Nope. Andruw Jones of audiophile fame, the great pioneer speaker, worked for KEF. He's got a great British accent.
Ooh, British.
That
means he's smart.
It is smart, and he sounds smart.
Good.
And that's what's important for this.
Nice. He can play a bad guy in Star Wars if he wants to.
He definitely could. Maybe even a bad guy in 007.
Sure.
But, yeah, he could play like you know what? He's definitely more Q. He's absolutely more Q.
He's a good guy. I like it.
He's a good guy.
He went from baseball player to bad guy to good guy. That's quick. This guy's very talented.
With me today, obviously, is my one of my favorite co-hosts, Brian Beasley.
How are you guys? How are you, Brian?
Thanks for joining us. I'm good, man.
Yeah? What have you been up to?
Drinking a little bit of Red Bull today.
Yeah, you needed it because you were like falling asleep before you hit the record button.
I did. Andruw Jones.
So what's his story?
He makes a lot of really good speakers.
I like it.
He's one of the few guys, and obviously it's in the interview, that they advertise the speakers on Amazon as Andruw Jones Pioneer Speakers. He's, to my knowledge,
That's
the only
impressive.
one. The only one. He's his personal brand, his personal stamp. That's how good he is. I don't even know if anybody, and there are other prolific speaker designers out there, of course, but none that are like, boom, stamp their name on it on Amazon. So this is the guy, the legend.
That's impressive.
He's an impressive guy. He's smart. He thinks, and God bless his soul, he loves to talk about himself. My favorite type of interviewer.
If only he could hit a fastball in the late 90s.
I'm guessing.
Do you even know who Andruw Jones from the Atlanta Braves was?
Of course not.
Yeah.
I'm not a baseball nerd. I'm an audio nerd.
I think in 96 he hit, I think he was the youngest man ever to hit a home run in the World Series. And I think he hit 2.
Okay. I'm going to quickly on
You're
air.
going to edit all that out?
No. I'm going to Google Andruw Jones
do it.
and see
Yes.
on
I think
air.
he's from the Caribbean too.
On air, who comes up first?
Okay.
This
definitely
Yahoo?
almost Hall of Famer Andruw Jones baseball player will come up before Andruw Jones Pioneer speaker.
And it's neither. It's a guy who plays basketball.
What?
Texas rallies around guard Andruw Jones after leukemia diagnosis.
Oh man, no. Way to bring us down, bro.
Twitter.
This is the baseball podcast, right? The occasional baseball podcast with me.
It really could be anything.
Yeah.
Right? It's so descriptive.
Did you tell your audience how big of a baseball fan I am? I don't know if they can tell from my knowledge of baseball players from 25 years ago.
He's literally wearing head to toe jerseys right now.
Yeah.
He's a big Yankees fan. Yankees gear from
You
Tough.
son of a bitch. Sox Nation, folks. That hurt. No, it didn't.
So Andruw Jones is currently employed at ELAC.
Okay.
Lives here in Los Angeles. Nice guy. ELAC, he's really pumped some new life into that company. And he's got some really popular three-way speakers. Concentric drivers is kind of his bag right now. But, you know, he's been doing this a long time, and he's done a lot of different speakers. But right now, he just came out with these amazing, a couple of years ago, budget speakers that kind of were drafting off of this Pioneer idea, higher sound, lower price points. Now he's slowly making his way up. He just released a $5,000 floor stander. Heaven forbid, but they sound good to my ears. So we got him. We pinned him down. He was very busy. His schedule was crazy, but I got him for at least a half hour, I think. So this is going to be him. Bees, can you do the thing?
Yeah, here you go. I'm going to hit the button. Here you go.
Hello and welcome to an interview that I've been waiting for quite some time. The great Andrew Jones of ELAC. How are you doing?
I'm doing better than I was. I got the CES bug on luckily the day of finishing setup. So I missed the first day, but now I'm back up and running at least half steam.
Half steam. I think half steam for you is full steam for the rest of us. Andrew Jones is of current fame from ELAC, but he has perhaps one of the longer histories of the people we've interviewed, and I'd really love to get into kind of an in-depth of your experience in audio, because I feel like you've had a couple of stops along the way, you've had a couple of major successes, and I think one of the interesting things that I've seen about you personally is that you have a Pioneer speaker on Amazon that literally uses your name to sell the speaker. And
Yes.
that by itself is somewhat of a rare thing. I don't think I've ever seen that before, at least on Amazon. And so your brand as a designer has some panache to it across the way. But I guess, maybe one of the things that the listeners might have already recognized is that you're not, even though you live in LA now, you're not from LA, I'm guessing. Where are you from originally?
Way back east. So I'm from a small town called Doncaster. Nearest city is Sheffield. Sheffield Steel, Joe Cocker, that kind of area. Yeah. And so I grew up in the north of England and moved down south for university and postgraduate research, and then the rest of my life until I moved out to the States. So this year it'll be 24 years I've been in LA.
Where did you do your schooling at while you were in London or England?
So I was just outside of London at the University of Surrey, a nice little town called Guildford. And I'd gone there specifically because of my interest in physics and acoustics, or I should say the other way around. I was already interested in early teens in hi-fi, and before that in electronics and science. I was always a geek. And hi-fi captured my imagination. And along with that, I have an identical twin brother. So we're both interested in the same subjects. Yes, identical twins. Oh, you didn't know that part? Right.
You guys couldn't see me, but my eyebrows just went up to my hairline.
The funny thing is, not just identical twin, but what's called mirror twins. So the first thing is that means he's left-handed and I'm right-handed. So you could say we got into stereo at a very early age since we were born as a stereo pair. Right?
Oh my goodness, is that like the family joke? I needed my own family joke, I think. I love that one.
And so we both got interested in first electronics and then hi-fi. And for some reason, I gravitated towards speakers and he gravitated towards the electronics. And so our whole school was geared towards that end goal. We decided we were so interested in that, we wanted to pursue it at university level. So for me, it was more acoustics oriented to learn about sound. So it's physics with acoustics. And my brother was kind of more pure electronics. So that was the first time we split apart. He went off to one university, I went to a different one. And then we joined together after 3 years in postgraduate research at his university. And he was studying amplifier topologies, and I was studying computer-aided crossover network design.
Wow.
And then I stayed on at that university in a different research group doing active noise control, so anti-noise. And he later joined me in that group. So everybody knows about active noise control these days with ANC headsets. So he did a lot of early work with that. And in fact, he did that for 20-odd years. The work I was doing was the loudspeaker part of doing active noise control on a large scale, like cancelling the noise from ships' engines or standby generators in hospitals. Because hospitals are in populated areas.
Yeah.
And when the standby generator kicks in, it might be at 2 a.m. when they've got a power outage or something. You don't want to wake up the whole neighbourhood. So I was building speakers to go around the engine exhaust to cancel that noise. So I was kind of getting rid of noise instead of producing it, but always wanted to be producing it. And then I got an opportunity to join KEF. And that's what started the actual... I knew about speakers on some level, and I'd studied, and I'd a member of the Audio Engineering Society, and I'd read all the journals and learn up about it. But you don't learn fully about speakers at a university. You might learn general acoustics and physics, but not how to design a driver.
There's no loudspeaker 101 design.
There might be odd little universities where it's integrated into part of the course, but you couldn't say you came out of that degree being a loudspeaker designer.
That's very interesting.
You really need sort of an apprenticeship to understudy, to learn about it. And that's what KEF was for me. It was the speaker university. Of the two companies, in my view, in England in those days, a long time ago, it was... along with BMW. They were the two preeminent companies doing really fundamental research. And so when I joined, and for KEF, for me it was KEF. And so when I got invited to join them, I started off in research rather than product development because I didn't know how to design speakers, but I did know how to do research. And I knew how to, so my things were like, researching better techniques for measuring speakers, getting it more accurate, those kind of things. It wasn't until a few years later I crossed over to the dark side of product design and development. But during that period, it was an intense process of learning as much as I could. Laurie Fincham, who was the technical director at that time, was my mentor. And the access we had to people. We were strong members of the Audio Engineering Society. Every month in London, they had an evening lecture. So it was a requirement that you went to that. And then we participated in it. Anyone needed equipment to help demonstrate anything, we'd drive it up because we were about an hour's drive outside. And there we would meet everybody, all the people from BMW, people from Celestion and Quad and all manner of people, and just become good friends. We'd all go out for dinner afterwards, and then, of course, we'd start talking technical. And even though we worked for different companies, without revealing secrets, we'd all discuss issues and problems. And I always remember Peter Walker, who Quad Electrostatics, so Peter was the founder of Quad, became a very close friend. You could guarantee you'd be talking over dinner, and you'd got a stumbling block that you'd come across, and I'd discuss it with Peter, and always a few days later he'd call you back and go, Andrew, I was thinking what you said over dinner, and he'd just lay out this beautiful, simple explanation. It wasn't complex maths for me to see through the problem. It was just a very fundamental way of looking at that. And anyone who was coming to give lectures, they'd pretty much always come down to KEF first and try out their lecture honours, and then go and give that lecture. So we had access to all the greats, and it was a great learning experience.
Do those kind of development communities still exist today, to your knowledge, or is this something that you I'm actually kind of wondering, like, how, or is it even possible for something like that to exist today because of the way things have changed, the nature of communication?
It's maybe less likely. There are still companies. BMW still does a lot of research. The Harman Group does a lot of research. So it is still around. It was always limited because a lot of companies, when you're talking about higher end hi-fi rather than mass hi-fi, companies are relatively small. The main guy is the guy who founded it, and he's still doing all the design work with a team, but it takes a long time to get into a position to either replace that or expand the team enough to be able to get great chances at developing yourself. So I think it was a bit of a golden era because hi-fi was so much more popular in those days. You know, it's still the best thing you could have at university or college or whatever was a badass stereo system, right?
I've heard that from people. There's the collegiate times are a very special time where it was like dorm room. I mean, maybe it wasn't a dorm room for you, but in the U.S., people like the dorm room hi-fi could get you chicks. That's like I've heard that, and it's just one of those things that I think has really unfortunately faded a little bit because it's not something someone would say today. I just feel like it's not maybe a car or maybe I don't know a fancy phone for these guys.
It's funny you should say that because I never considered myself a chick magnet, and even having a really good stereo system, I don't really think it got me there. It was sad to say. Maybe it might come out of my shell in more recently. So anyone who's listening, you know.
So after KEF, what happened next for you? Was it Pioneer or was there something?
No, those are an intermediate step. So through all the people I'd met with KEF, I was invited to come stateside. So it's Floyd Toole, who was head of research or head scientist, whatever his exact title was, at Harman. So he'd been at the NRC in Canada. He'd joined Harman. Longtime friend of Laurie Fincham, who was our technical director at KEF, and myself. He was looking for people, and KEF was changing hands, sold to a new company. And lots of changes. They'd also amalgamated with Celestion, and we're all trying to work out what do all of us want to do. But when this opportunity came to join the Harman Group, and in this specific instance, Infinity, because Infinity had been purchased by Harman a few years earlier and kind of existing sort of still semi-autonomously, but was gradually being brought more into the fold. They were looking for some new blood. And so invited Laurie Fincham and myself to come over. And I kind of waited a year. I thought, I'll let Laurie see what it's like in the States. And, of course, it's a big change. It's not just a change in job. It's a change in everything. So left it a year, did some final designs for KEF, and then moved out to join Infinity. So Laurie and I worked together again for over 3 years. But then another opportunity came up, and this time it was with Pioneer. So they'd built a lab, they'd built some fantastic facilities, and I was asked if I wanted to head up the design team there. And that was a very interesting idea. Not the most obvious career path, because that would have been in 94 when I joined Pioneer. Still at that time, why with the companies I'd been with would I join a Japanese loudspeaker company? Because if you were to ask anybody about Japanese speakers, the idea was they can't design speakers. What I knew was that's entirely wrong. The engineering capability that existed in Japanese audio companies was second to none. It's just that maybe the outcome that they achieve wasn't to our ears from a sound perspective, but the engineering quality and the research that they'd been doing through the years. Because I studied all the journals, I saw what they're doing, and so I thought, people might think I'm foolish to do this, but there's a definite reason I'm doing it, to work with them and just take the best of my ideas with the best of their ideas. That would be a fantastic opportunity to pursue. And almost in a not so nice thought pattern that if I fail, no one will blame me because nobody's made any good Japanese speakers. If I succeed, I'm the only one who ever has. Kind of idea. And so, yeah, let's give this a go. And I was there for 17 years. Never believed that could have been the case.
So, based on your experience now, looking back, where kind of were they going wrong in their thought process?
I think it was simply the aspects of sound reproduction that they concentrated on were not the same as we did. So, much more interested in the dynamic and percussive characteristics of the music rather than necessarily the tonality. Now, that has changed through the years. And having started with Pioneer, but started doing Pioneer speakers for the American market, that was my role, head up an American design team. But once we started doing TAD, it changed because that's a worldwide product and it's a high-end product. So TAD was a division of Pioneer that already existed. It was founded in around 1978 with the idea of doing studio monitors, kind of following in the tradition of JBL and the L100 and that kind of product. So they'd hired an American engineer from Harman, in fact, from JBL, to oversee design work. And they've developed the beryllium beryllium compression driver. So this was the first use of beryllium in a compression driver. It turned out so good, they decided rather than just calling it Pioneer, it will be TAD, Technical Audio Devices. And the design engineer was Bart Lecanthe. It took off. So they became preeminent as perhaps the best quality compression driver available at the time, and still almost to this day. So I'd been designing lower cost Pioneer speakers and wanted to move upwards in price point. But again, do we call it just Pioneer or do we call it Elite, which was one of the Pioneer brands? In the end, I said, well, we have TAD. Could we do a home version, take TAD into the home? And that set the cat amongst the pigeons because they were very protective of TAD, and quite rightly so. And who am I to suggest that I steal the TAD logo? So we had big meetings and we toured the studios to find out the current feelings about TAD. And it was decided, TAD is still so revered that I can't just do a mid-price speaker. It would have to be a flagship. I went, yay. Right, okay, I'm up for doing a flagship. So I was put in charge of deciding what that flagship should be, which was both very exciting and really scary because it's a blank sheet of paper and it's got to be a flagship. What do I do? And so as we were developing that, there was myself, my team based in the US, with some Japanese engineers and the Japanese engineering team in Tokyo. What happens if what I'm going for from a sound point of view doesn't match what they think is good? Well, I'd been assured that it would be my decisions. But I kind of don't want to be fighting them. Right. But I don't want to be deliberately changing what I feel I want for what they might want. Well, it never happened. I think time had moved on to some degree. At the same time, even if you're listening personally for different things, one speaker could encompass both of those simultaneously, rather than only providing one aspect of the reproduction. And I think we were at a level where that was happening. So that was a fantastic time, starting off the TAD home speakers, and carried me through. I think we launched the first one in 2003, and so it was on the market for a long time before I decided to move from Pioneer and do this current ELAC job.
Was there a certain point at your career where you kind of felt like you were learning, and now you're starting to get recognition for your work, and you felt like, when did you feel like you became the Andrew Jones instead of just Andrew Jones?
I would say it's began at Pioneer. Certainly in my days of KEF, I was either in research or as chief engineer, but we still have Laurie Fincham as technical director. So it was his show, and quite rightly so. You know, I never felt that I wasn't getting my due recognition in some respects. No, I wasn't the front person, but that was okay because, you know, Laurie was technical director. Once I got to Infinity, I had more exposure because we'd both come to kind of work together. We realised that we needed each other, let's say. We sparked off each other always. Laurie would never let you just get away with something. You had to prove every time that your ideas were right and could be verified, and I appreciated that. So there's a bit of it came up in Infinity, and then more so as I started Pioneer, because you need more of a front person when you're with a company like Pioneer. Because again, it's the image of Japanese speakers. You're not going to be successful selling those unless there's some extra personality, let's say, behind it. And so that's what we started doing with Pioneer. But it was TAD that really cemented that, because I don't want this to come off as boasting, but I was Mr. TAD in that respect. Just like Bart Lecanthe had been the guy for TAD Pro, I was that person for home. I was the front person all the time. And I'd come out so much out of my shell that I just enjoyed being in front of the room, doing all the talks and the demos. So it was a natural fit, and it allowed me to do more of that. And so definitely it was TAD was the real big start of being the showman, being the person that represented the product. And it felt good because I was both designing it and representing it. Mm-hmm. And I think that always comes off differently than just representing someone's product. I remember being at some show once, and they've got one of the magazines had got awards events, and apparently Pioneer had won an award for some receiver. But I was going to be the only person representing Pioneer was turning up at the ceremony. So the presenter came over and said, Andrew, I know you didn't design this, but would you mind being the one that receives the award? Because none of the other guys turned up. And I go, oh, sure, I'll do that. So I gave a little speech and said, I'm receiving this award for a product I didn't design on behalf of all the people who received an award for my product that they didn't design.
I think too, it's not just from a marketing perspective, but the fact that you can attach a personality or a face or something human to something that's distinctly non-human across all forms of communication is comforting to the human nature. You're just like, oh, this is the person behind the speaker, not just a box and material. And I think that's for almost anything. When you talk about doing media like we're doing, people like to see a face. They don't just want to hear a floating voice. You know, they want a personality attached to the conversation. And I think that's very interesting that, you know, you've done that and that it's part of your messaging and that it's actually, you know, worked quite well, I would say, just from my perspective. It's done very good things for the company. And now with ELAC, you know, you're at the shows, you're doing the presentations, and you're not, you're shying away. You know, I don't consider it to be boastful at all when you have a formula that works and that I think makes people just feel better about the branding in general.
That's true. You have to be careful with that because, and it's not always needed once you're established. Take Klipsch, for example. Mm-hmm. Paul Klipsch isn't with us any longer, but the company is still one of the most successful American speaker brands, and everybody recognizes the brand name Klipsch and the quality that it represents. The idea is to build ELAC up to that. ELAC as a brand name wasn't known over here, but I was. So people naturally gravitate to the fact that I'm with ELAC now. Mm-hmm. But ultimately, it's not just about God, am I really going to say this? It's not just about me, right? It's about the brand, because it's not just one person that is involved in making it happen. It's always a team effort. Okay, I come up with concepts. I'm pretty much, I am solely responsible for what is the sound that we achieve. But it's still, I couldn't do this without everybody else. I'd be just another guy designing in a garage and trying to sell 1 or 2 speakers as a hobby. So, but definitely it certainly helps to a friendly face always. Hi-fi is always, it's one of those kind of cult things. You don't need it. You got some strange reasons why you into higher end audio, and you want to know there's somebody responsible behind the creation, someone you can talk to.
So having such a base you were talking about in research and community back early on in your career, are there any particular designers or people or personalities that influenced you early on that you kind of idealized, or even a design philosophy that kind of inspired you?
There's certainly people who've inspired me. I mentioned Laurie Fincham. He was my mentor. I learned not just facts from him, but I learned how I should be doing things, how I should challenge ideas, verify them, not just accept them. Mm-hmm. But being part of that team, we had a superb, quite large engineering team, and everyone was selected for good reasons and good capabilities. So we had a lot of chance to discuss and dream of new ideas and verify them. And then access to people like, again, I mentioned Peter Walker from Quad. Such a brilliant guy. So we could talk to him anytime. I've had so many late nights drinking whiskey and talking hi-fi with him. Lipschitz and Van der Kooi, 2 professors from University of Toronto, I think, in Canada. Brilliant researchers. So if you wanted to take things further to understand, you could give them research topics and they'd come back with something because they were interested in audio, but from really fundamental research ideas. Dick Small, so Teal Small parameters that everybody talks about for designing the low frequency response of a speaker. Well, we were good friends with Neville Teal and Dr. Richard Small, to such an extent that Dick Small came to work with us for a year on sabbatical because he was at the University of Sydney. And then a few years later, he joined us full time. And so I was doing some joint research projects with him. So these are just, people who had such great understanding of things, and we just had access to work with them and talk with them.
So given that you now, looking back over the timeline, can kind of see how the research tied into design and development, I have a question for you, and that would be, has the technique, has the design, has the research changed much over the past 40 years or however long you've been doing it? Are we still implementing elements that was discovered back then? Has anything drastic been uncovered recently? Because to me, as an outsider looking in, it just seems like there hasn't been. I mean, we have a couple, even the electrostatic technologies and now planars in headphones, relatively new. But the quads were electrostats, were they not?
Yes.
And that was way back. So, what's your take on that?
I mean, certainly you look at speakers then and now and you go, why should I buy a new one? What's different? It's refinement. And it's an understanding both of the materials technology. There are definitely advanced materials being used for speaker cones and tweeter diaphragms that didn't exist perhaps a long time ago. Our understanding of how to use those materials and how to get best out of them, our understanding of the interaction of the directional characteristics of loudspeakers, those kind of things have aided us in making speakers sound better and better, even if from the outside and even a cursory examination on the insides, the mechanisms are all the same. It's a coil of wire in a magnet gap pushing on a cone. Yeah, the cone surround materials have changed, the cone materials have changed, the voice coil formers have changed, the magnets have changed, but the concept is unchanged. There's not that many ways to make things move, if you think about it, from electricity. It's either electrostatic or it's electrodynamic. And electrodynamic can be a voice coil in a magnetic gap pushing on a cone, or it can be unwrapped and spread over the diaphragm as in a planar magnetic type. And even a folded ribbon AMT, it's the same thing. It's just kind of configured slightly differently, but the mechanism is fundamentally the same. The only outlier there, you could say, is direct movement of the air by energizing a plasma field. That's not new. I had a device from the early 70s that did that. It's even earlier than that. 60s they first came out with those ideas. Very impractical. So you could say, if you're going to think of something that hasn't been developed to a fully practical form, it would be that kind of speaker. But you look at it and go, there's a good reason why it hasn't been developed beyond what it is, because the physics of it make it very impractical to take it beyond what it currently does. But there's a couple of products on the market that do a plasma field tweeter, and it has its virtues. It's also very limited in its use. So I think it's down to just refinements.
If you had a design wish of one thing that could be corrected, that's your biggest hurdle in terms of loudspeaker design, what is that hurdle? Let's just say, as an example, for the cell phone, one of the biggest hurdles right now is battery life. I wish I had a battery that lasted forever and ever on the phone and never died and never diminished. What is that element for you in speaker design?
That is interesting. I think one of the biggest practical difficulties I have is the mechanical forces generated when you put a drive unit onto a box always excite the box. The box becomes part of the sound of the speaker. Now, of course, we can deal with it. I had ways of dealing with it at TAD. Lots of companies have their own methods of dealing it, but it's not straightforward. And so as you come to lower cost speakers, the box is always, because you can't afford all these complex arrangements, it always becomes part of an issue. And the idea that you can brace it away is wrong. So that would be an area that I'm more and more interested in looking at. Because if you think about it, one of the things I have said about my affordable speakers, like the debut line, when I'm trying to get the best price-performance ratio, well, everyone's trying to do that, obviously, as you design something. But when you're trying to do it at very low cost, you've got to give some things up. And I've often said that what I gave up in the B6 was some cabinet vibration. I know the cabinet has some issues. They're not always that obvious, but they're there. I put the money into other aspects. It would be nice to not have that as a limitation.
So if there was I'm sure this is not the right technical term, but if there was some type of material design that was completely inert or just for whatever crazy reason
And cheap.
Yeah, and cheap. Well, I mean, that didn't vibrate at all,
Yeah.
or a resonant frequency. It had no reason. Is it possible that a
It
material
had no
doesn't?
resonances, and it was perfectly stiff, yes. I mean, yes, we can get close to that with complex construction and heavy materials and well-braced. You just can't do it at an affordable way. Okay. And I have, from time to time, tried some form of vibration isolation, but even that is not a straightforward thing to do. And I'm looking for better ways to do that at lower cost.
Very cool.
Because I always hear it. I listen to a female voice and go, yeah, that part's the cabinet. So it is there.
Can you describe that at all for our listeners? Like what?
No, because then you'll definitely go looking for it.
So now you're moving full steam ahead with ELAC, and part of that initial success, I feel like, with the debut line and some of the other, I wouldn't say bargain speakers, but they were definitely cost efficient speakers, revolved around the concentric driver.
Yes.
Do you have a thing for it? Does it work good at the budget level? Do you think it works good overall? Is there something about that design that's kind of making its way into your design sensibilities?
For me, it's always, ever since we first were working on that kind of concept at KEF, I saw the potential of what it can do.
So let me just interrupt you first. Did you have a hand in designing the UniQ driver that they currently...
So at that time, I was in research. So I didn't come up with the idea of developing it. I did a lot of work on building samples and helping to understand it, but I was not part of the development team that made it a product. That came later as I crossed over to become chief engineer and doing product development, at which point I continued developing and refining it. And there's some missteps in the early days on understanding how it interacted with the room and what kind of sound balance it should have to sound optimum. And that gets to the point of it's not all about measurements. You know what some things ought to measure like based on experience of if they measure like that, they will sound like this. Mm-hmm. But if it's some other kind of thing, those measurements are not always relevant. Like doing a car system. Can I do the same kind of measurement of a speaker at the listening position in a car and understand that it should be a flat response? No, it's not that simple. So measurements have to tie in with what it sounds like. Right.
And just to interject, while we're on this subject, I'd love to get your reaction to a couple of statements that I've read from other designers that throw measurements out the window based upon the idea that they have measured two different systems. They measure identical, yet one sounds great and one sounds horrible. Therefore, it devalues measurements to the point where they're just going to go ahead and design around them or without them?
So I would say they don't understand measurements because no speakers can measure identically and sound different. So you've done...
you're saying even not just frequency response, but all possible measurements?
Okay. They can't... You can't do a complete set of measurements of on and off axis response and distortion and all these things from two and get them identical for two different configurations of speakers. It doesn't work like that. There will always be differences. So, and I also question often people's ability to measure accurately. This is always I was on a speaker panel once at Rocky Mountain, and we were asked how have modern techniques for speaker design, computer-aided or measurements or analyzing cabinet vibration, all these techniques, how have they changed how you go about designing speakers? And I go, they haven't, because we had them in the late 70s, early 80s at KEF. I've always used those. What's changed is that it's now affordable and it runs on a PC, which means lots of people can buy it and get the wrong answer. Because unless you know how a measurement system works and the interaction of the test signal with the device under test, you push a button and get an answer. You don't know if it's the right answer. If you go out and buy a piece of test gear and then you start buying some drivers and thinking you're measuring them accurately to represent what they would sound like if you get the perfect flat response from what you design, you don't, because you don't know the limitations of that test gear. So that's my first answer towards did you really measure it? And they measured identically. I can't even build a pair of speakers where the left and right measure identically. They measure sufficiently close, but they're never strictly in terms of what identical means. Identical. So if you're going to try and track down everything that could affect the sound of a speaker, every choice you make of the drivers, the crossover points, the phase characteristics, the cabinet construction, all of that affects the sound. So trying to think you could, in two different configurations, get them to measure exactly the same on every single parameter that is a measurement of a speaker: on-axis response, off-axis, cabinet vibration, phase response, dynamic characteristics, isn't going to happen. But it does always, I do always design with measurements, and I listen. But I'm going to set myself a target of what I want a certain set of measurements to be. Then I'll build it, and I'll measure it to verify did it meet what I wanted it to be. And I'll listen to it. And if I don't like what I hear, the first thing I'm going to do is say, did it actually meet closely enough the requirements I set? You'll always go back with hindsight and go, yeah, in fact, it's not in this region. That's not what I exactly intended. So go back and adjust it till it's close to what you intended. Then listen. Is it now closer to what you want the sound to be? And if it is, then you've got some correlation between the measurement and the listening. If making that objective change didn't give you the subjective result that you're seeking, then go and find where the correlation is, because it wasn't what you thought it was, and learn more that way.
Do you think that you could design now, with your experience, a loudspeaker completely by ear without any measurements at all, or would it just take a lot longer?
Take a hell of a lot longer. Now, I was involved while I was at Pioneer in helping out with a couple proposals for car systems. So I got involved. I was so nervous and frightened with that because I knew that my standard set of measurements are not going to be appropriate for a simple evaluation in a car. I'm going to have to listen. Now, sounds like I don't listen when I'm designing. Of course I listen when I'm designing. But like you were saying, the measurements, I design on a computer towards an endpoint. I've made a lot of choices based on experience. So I can quickly get to an endpoint. The endpoint isn't the finished product. It's the start of listening. Okay. It's not I'm listening to a raw tweeter or an unequalized tweeter and saying this unequalized tweeter sounds better than that unequalized tweeter. Well, of course it does, because they've both got different responses. So, but it allows me to get to a point of starting listening much quicker. And then all the refinement is based on what I hear. And that's the dark area, the kind of the magic area of speaker design, because if there was a perfect recording that you could evaluate against, you could say, once it sounds as identical to the real performance as possible, then that's the speaker. But we don't actually have that. I've gone on ad nauseum in the past about what is accuracy and what do we capture in order to be able to compare, reproduce sound to the real live performance. We've got to capture that real live performance such that when we play it back, if the equipment is all perfect, we hear the real live performance. But that falls apart at the very first point of how do we capture a representation of that performance. Which microphones? There isn't a perfect microphone.
I found that very interesting too. Just putting together the podcast, that the microphones themselves have a frequency response.
Yes, they do. And let's take, if we're going to go that route, let's take what do most people traditionally use as a reference standard microphone for acoustic measurements. Brüel & Kjær. The 4133 was the classic half-inch capsule that everybody used as this is a calibrated mic, omnidirectional, flat out to 20K within a very tight confines. They're all identical. Is that what you want to use for recording? For a start, how do you do stereo recording with an Omni mic? So you're going to have spaced Omnis. But they're going to convert that sound through to the ears in a special way with the phase relationships between them. It's not the same as a cross pair of figure of eights or cardioids. Cardioids have imperfections built in. So the process is already broken down. And then can you capture with a cross pair what you hear in that room? No, you can't, because it deals with the ratio between direct and reverberant sound differently from what the brain processes in the two ears when you're listening to it. So you're not going to perceive what you perceived at the real event over two speakers captured by who knows how many microphones you're going to end up using. And most of the time, nearly every piece of music we listen to, there's not even any attempt at that process. There's an attempt at creating an event by the producers, the recording engineers, the mixing engineers, the mastering engineers. Some of the instruments don't have a reality that you can listen acoustically with two ears. So it kind of breaks down. I'm not saying you should never try and attempt to recreate reality as closely as possible. It's just you've got to be really careful what you're assuming is the reality and how you've captured it. So that's where the listening process really becomes critical. You could say, what flavor do I believe in? What do I want to hear? Just like I was saying the difference in the old days between the Japanese engineering and mine. They're listening to capture different aspects of the recording. It's the same thing they're recording, but they place a different emphasis on some of the features than I would. So what do I want the sound that I give you to be from that set of loudspeakers? And I've got to carry that with me, and hopefully I'm consistent with that. Hopefully I can get the essence of that in each of the different products, and hopefully my ideas of what sounds good. I know it's not everybody's idea. Otherwise, no one would buy any other speaker but my own. So different people have different things they want to hear, but there is what I want to give them, and if it's popular, then we've got a business, and I've got a career.
Andrew, I just want to thank you so much for joining us on the program. It's been a really entertaining time. So thank you for taking the time out.
Well, thank you. Anyone who gives me a chance to talk is always good in my books.
Awesome, man. Thanks again.
All right, my pleasure.